I suppose we ought to look at why obesity occurs, which sounds like a really easy question to answer. But when I started looking at it, there turned out to be layers upon layers of reasons why reptiles become overweight. So let me start by throwing something into the mix about what humans are like. And I think we're feeders. So every time I go around my grandmother's house or around my auntie's house or around my, friend's mum's house, oh, have a biscuit, have a cake, are you staying for dinner? It's almost culturally compulsive for us to feed things.
Yeah, or I've got 5 potatoes left. Can you finish them up for me?
Yes. This is it. And it's good manners to provide food. And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why we find it so good, so pleasurable to feed things.
Yeah.
And we've already used the phrase "killing them with kindness," but I think when we look at it from that perspective, we're trying to do a favor, we're trying to do something nice, and killing them with kindness sounds like a more appropriate phrase the more I think about it. I was speaking to a store owner. In fact, it was Chaz up at Snakes and Adders in Sheffield, and he says he regularly gets the situation where they've run out of locust. And a lizard owner has come in for their food, and they say, "Hey, well, we're out of locust today. They'll be in tomorrow." And the owner goes into a panic. But oh my God, he needs to eat today.
Yeah.
But does he really?
Yeah. Well,
does he really?
No, it's the short answer, isn't it? A lot of the time.
What would happen in the wild if there weren't any locusts on the shelf?
Well, that's the thing. These animals are ultimately, a lot of them, wild animals. Well, they're not wild as in from the wild,
but they behave as such.
They behave as such, and so we have to think about how they would live and what they would encounter and some of the challenges they would face in the wild. And they wouldn't be fed a box of 20 locusts every day in the wild.
And if they miss a day,
or 2 days,
exactly,
or 3 days,
exactly.
But they shouldn't, if they're not eating for a week or two.
Then think about it.
If they're a lizard, you know, bearded dragons, if they don't eat for a week or two, they might start to get liver problems and things. But a day here and there, 2 days, 3 days, doesn't matter.
Not going to be a worry, is it?
Yeah.
So.
And speak to your vet. If it depends on the condition of the animal. If they are a little bit thin, we might want to be feeding them every day.
Often,
and more. Yeah, exactly. So it depends on the animal.
I mean, as humans, we're kind of conditioned ourselves to eat 3 times a day. But as mammals, we use a lot of our energy, the calories from our meals, to create body heat.
Yeah.
And that's not something reptiles have to do because they get all their body heat from the sun or from your heater.
Yeah. So basically, why does obesity happen? Too much food or not enough exercise.
Exercise is something I'd like to speak to you about.
Yeah. So that the exercise is something that all owners can consider. Enclosure sizes. Yeah. That's a controversial issue. But
still
it's
relevant.
Important.
Yeah, still relevant.
Keeping animals in enclosures that are too small can lead to obesity.
Yeah, okay. The other reason why I think obesity is more prevalent is because feeding your reptile is one of the most interesting things you can do with it. Whether it's a snake or a lizard, feeding day is one of the most interesting times.
Well, a lot of snakes are sedentary and do hide a lot of the time, and when you see them in action is when you're feeding them. So I totally get your point, and I think some people want to see that action a bit more frequently than it probably should happen.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
How about prescribed feeding regimes? Because I remember working in a reptile pet store in the 80s and in the 90s, and if the animal was feeding, that was a good thing. Keep feeding it.
Yeah.
How often do I need to feed my snake? Once a week.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult to answer that question in shorthand. I think I think an average of once a week or once every 2 weeks for most snakes works, but it doesn't have to be bang on.
Yeah.
You can miss a week here and there.
And it depends on the condition of the animal.
And it depends on the condition of the animal, and it depends on the size of the prey item that you're giving, or how many prey items you're giving at once.
Yeah. and where the animal comes from and how it would experience food in their natural environment.
Yeah.
And whether or not they have, breeding seasons and hibernation seasons. And
whether you're breeding them because that's a huge energy expense.
Exactly.
Whether you're then brumating them because that makes a big difference.
There's a lot of things to think about.
Lots of variables. What I would say about corn snakes, and this is just an observation, it seems to be the ones that the owners feed rats. That's just very simple.
And when we say rats, we're talking...
usually it's weaner rats.
Yeah.
Because the corn snake's only so big.
Yeah.
But if you stick to medium or large mice, because they're a fair bit smaller than a chunky old weaner rat, I think it's just too big a prey item.
Yeah.
Too frequently.
And would you say that good advice to someone who presents an obese reptile, would you say that good advice is to feed less often and smaller sizes? Is that generic advice that's universal?
If you prolong the interval too much, the animals are so hungry that they are, I think, to some extent in distress.
Good point.
I've seen snakes that have been starved for weeks and weeks and weeks, often as part of prosecution cases.
Goodness.
And you're opening the viv, and they're just biting the substrate, and they're biting the hide, and they're just so desperate to eat.
So fasting is not an option.
I don't think so. So my point is, I think you don't want to leave them months without eating to control their weight. You want to stick to a reasonable interval, but feed a smaller item.
So instead of feeding it once a week, you might feed it once every 10 days.
Maybe, or every 2 weeks.
Or every 2 weeks.
Or every 3 weeks.
Dependent on the
animal.
size of the animal. Yeah, good point.
And then the size of the prey item is very important as well.
For sure. And it's important to stress that we're talking largely about adult snakes here when we're talking about frequency of feeding, because, of course, young animals need to feed more often, obviously appropriate size food, but more often because they're growing.
Growth requires energy and protein.
But when they stop growing, what do they do with those extra calories?
They store it.
Yeah. How about the point, and this is an interesting conversation I had with a friend of mine, captive foodstuffs are nutritionally dense, but wild foodstuffs are, evolutionarily speaking, usually suboptimal. It's the sick animals, the old animals, the frail animals that get caught by predators. And so we obviously don't want to perpetuate that. You don't want sick, frail, old feeder mice in captivity. So it's not something we can do much with, but it's an interesting observation that all of the big, healthy, well-fed, well-nourished mice, locusts, etc., are a very different foodstuff animal to what they catch in the wild.
Or even the vegetation. I see so many Herman's tortoises that eat bags of floret lettuce.
Yeah.
With your lush kale and your lamb's lettuce and your romaine lettuce.
Yeah.
But if you go to Mediterranean regions, it's all brown, fibrous,
dried up grasses.
Exactly. So feeding weeds and things is what we recommend, because that's better.